When I was a child, there were so many families in this place, and people. And we used to walk to each other's homes because from each home there were paths through the woods. And nothing was pretty much clear. Now you go through the area and everything's grown up. Everyone knew one another. And there was a lot of back and forth, you need eggs, you go get eggs from so and so. Party lines on the telephone. It might have been 4 or 5 different families on the telephone line. We walked to the store. The store was Gillum's store. And the old bridge before this bridge, we used to walk to the store, and when the cars would come, you could actually feel the breeze of the cars because it wasn't much room between the car and the walking space. The bridge was so narrow. We swam in the Rapidan River, we fished in it. I mean, that was quite a bit to do. There was a farm, the Shackelford Farm, which is now Willow Grove. That's where we played baseball, in that field. Everyone had fruit trees. We played a lot of, we would organize and play a lot of football, basketball, baseball. So we were pretty active. Everyone walked to church, or the kids. Sunday school was a must. The church was active a lot going on. And the ladies, the older ladies in the school were real serious about that Sunday school. I would say the church was a focal place of the community. That's where all the activities went on.
Tell me a little bit about what life was like in this little community.
Wow. Everyone sort of lived off the land. All families had gardens. Most of them had some type of livestock, pigs or chickens. And a lot of the food that we ate, we grew on the place, and it wasn't uncommon for young kids to hunt during that time, because I can remember at about 10 years of age, I had a rifle and I would go out squirrel hunting, and my dad would rabbit hunts. But during that time, we didn't consider it to be a sport. We actually hunted, fished, and we gardened for. Actually, we did it for food, and we would go in town for groceries on Saturdays, and my mother would do a lot of shopping. And but when I'm thinking back, I can remember my mother. She bought a lot of groceries for, the income and so forth that my father was bringing in. So I'm thinking that maybe the money went a lot farther, and the food must have been a lot cheaper. And a lot of things, we didn't have too many, things that my father, bought as far as expensive toys or anything. We were very creative as far as entertaining ourselves. We would make toys, But it was as far as I'm concerned, it was a real good life. My father gave us, he would buy us clothes at the beginning of the year. We might get a couple outfits for Christmas, and we always got the week's lunch money on Mondays, and I'm thinking it was probably like 15 cents a day for lunch, and he would always give us that. You know, we always had lunch. We always had books, because a lot of kids didn't have books. You know, a lot of them we had to share, but we always had books, and we always had clothes. You know, but it was so many of us that the boys would, you know, they would pass down the clothes. But we also worked at young ages. My first job was about 10 years old. And I had two brothers older and an uncle that my father he was like his dad also, because my grandfather, died at a young age. And when they became teenagers, he bought a pickup, a few lawnmowers, and some lawn equipment, and he sent them out to work. And I was just a young kid, and I would go along with them. That was kind of my first job. And as they graduated from school, I went on my own, and I always had work to do. I would walk to Route 15, the stop sign, hitchhike into town, because there was always someone from the neighborhood going into town. I would go in the morning, and I would, most of my jobs were on Rapid Ann Road down near the high school. And I had different people that I would go work in the flower beds, cut lawns, and that type of thing. That evening, I would walk back uptown, and there was a certain spot people would see you as they were going back to the neighborhood. I would hitchhike back home. And when I wasn't working there, I would go to Woodbury, because you could always go out there and make a few dollars carrying someone's golf clubs. So I was never without a job. Automobiles was a big thing for families. Okay, people would, or members of this community, yes, most of them had nice vehicles, and that was kind of like a symbolic of, I guess, some type of achievement, maybe. Maybe showing progress, yes, or some type of success. And but yeah, people had cars, and they had some nice cars. One of my great uncles used to drive a '55 Chevrolet. His name was Lawrence Day, and it was the cleanest car. And also some other people. Also, I had an uncle that used to always shine the car. It was just that, people back then, they took a lot of pride in their cars. I started attending school at Prospect Heights. I remember Prospect being a fairly new school, and it was a really, I remember it being very clean. And they took such good care of that school. I can also remember the teachers and how they related to the kids. It was a lot more about, lot more than academics. It was, they became more personable. They related to the families. They also taught different life skills. And when I say life skills, being on time, being honest. They taught you hygiene. They taught you how to study. In other words, I thought that they did a really good job considering what they, the challenges that they had during that period. Orange schools were segregated back during the period that I started school, and actually it was that way all the way through the 6th grade. 1967, I graduated into the 7th grade, and during that year, they created a new school, which was called the Orange Intermediate School. The Orange Intermediate School was on Bellevue Avenue in Orange. I attended that school for a year, and then in the 8th grade, I moved on to Orange County High School. Sports played a big part in my teen years. I started playing football at Orange County High School in the 8th grade. And if I'm not mistaken, that was the only year that I wasn't a varsity player. From the 9th through the 12th, I actually was a letterman all 4 of those years. And I played multiple positions. I would play offense, and then same night I would play defense on special teams, and and there were a number of times or a number of games where I would never even come off the field. I tell the story about Orange football where August 10th would always be the first day of practice, and that day we would probably have over 100 players coming out, trying to make that team. And by game time, we might have 25 players because it was such, tough practices that a lot of people just couldn't bear it. Well, I lived here until I was 18. I left in 1974, and that's when I joined the Air Force. Okay, but prior to joining the Air Force, I was working a few jobs. I attended Germana for a short period of time, for a couple of quarters, and I had done some few things. I worked at a steel factory, and and I never mind working, but while I was working 8 hours, I was going to community college, and I just decided that, hey, I'm going to try something different. So I joined the Air Force at I think I was 19 years old when I joined. After finishing basic, they told me I was going to be an aircraft mechanic, and that was based on my tests. Okay, so they sent me to Illinois for 6 weeks, and I got my assignment. It was to Dover Air Force Base. So I arrived at Dover, biggest airplane I've ever seen in my life, the C-5, and that's what I was assigned to. And they assigned me to a gentleman from Wilmington, Delaware. He was a civilian. He was an elderly guy. He had fought in World War II, and he sat me down and talked to me that first week, and one-on-one. And he said, hey, if you want to succeed, listen to what I tell you, do what I tell you, and I don't think you'll have a problem. Well, this guy was the #1 mechanic on the C-5s. He was actually the what we call the red ball crew chief, and that's when the aircraft are on the runway or on the ramp ready to go and they break. He would be the one that they would call, and he was very proficient in flight controls, landing gear. Whenever they jacked them in the air, and he would be the one that they would call, and I was kind of his right-hand guy. So, and not only that, but my chief, he happened to be an African-American guy, and he also encouraged me. He told me that anytime a class comes up on whatever system of that jet, I want you in it. So I was very well trained. And when it was time for me to get out, they really wanted me to stay, okay? But I wanted to come back home, and my son had just been born a couple of years before, and I wanted him to grow up with his family, and my wife, she was sort of homesick. So I came back to Orange, and but I really liked it, and not only was I working on the jets, I was a member of the Air Force Honor Guard, and that's when we would of course, Dover was the #1 base for receiving those that are killed or wounded in action. That's where they would come. So we would be out all in the middle of the nights and so forth, receiving those bodies. And not only that, but we would do a lot of traveling as far as performing ceremonies, marching. My first day there, a recruiter took me to see the chief. The chief told the recruiter to take me to support. When I walked into the room, it was 10 African Americans and a white supervisor. And I never knew what support was. Right? Later, as I settled in that day, they called in on the radio, said that they're on the way. So the white supervisor said, let's go. So we all go outside. He drives the truck and we're on the back. And we go to the end of the runway, and the F-105s would turn the corner, and when they turn the corner, the pilot would release the parachute and it would blow it over into the field. We would jump out of the truck and roll up the parachute, put them in the truck, and take them back to the parachute shop for repacking. And I did this for 1 year, okay? And then within that year was another white guy that came into the shop. But then it was nine and one white guy and a white supervisor, right? Well, I had only signed up for that year, for 1 year, for the first year. And I had an option of leaving, because if you had active duty, you can sign up for that 1 year to see if you like it. If not, you have to say 6. Well, I signed up for 1 year, and at the end of that year, I went back to that chief, and I said, Chief, I came to work on airplanes, and I did not come to roll up parachutes. I said, if I can't work on an airplane, I'm out of here. So he immediately assigned me to the flight line. When I started working there, they had 105s, F-105s from the Vietnam era. And not long after, they converted to A-7s. And that's when I became a full-time technician. After a short time, I became a crew chief, and I had my own airplane that I managed on a daily basis. For about 4 or 5 years, I crewed a A-7, serial number 0198. Okay, and I sort of followed it everywhere it went. I've traveled with it.
Can you list a couple of its capabilities? Because this one, viewers should be very interested in this.
The A-7 was a close ground support attack airplane. Wasn't very fast. It flew about 800 and some knots, but it was a deadly weapon as far as its payload capability and most of all, its accuracy. Because it can drop a bomb into a pickup truck. That's how accurate it is. And that's when the aircraft moved away from a lot of mechanicals into a lot of avionics. You know, so pretty much when you crew a fighter, you're responsible for everything. You know, jacking it, towing it, engine runs, anything mechanical, flight controls. You know, and you have other crew chiefs that you have an assistant doing that 1 weekend a month, but during the regular civilian day, you've got it yourself, you know, and you get assistance from the other crew chiefs. We sort of worked as pretty good as teams, and in 1990 or 91, we converted to the F-16 Falcon. And that was a whole different ball game, because you're talking an airplane that's flying 14, maybe 13, 1400 miles an hour. And even a newer technology, which was called fly-by-wire. I benefited from something that happened to an African American that I work with. And it all dealt with the Virginia Air National Guard and the Confederate flag. Because the two of us were crew chiefs. Actually, it was three of us that were working on the flight line. And the Air Guard used the Confederate flag for its insignia. And some of the African American troops were complaining. And this particular gentleman, we worked right across from each other. He had an airplane over here and I was on this side, and we were sort of in competition, and we were good friends. But he spoke up. He wanted the flag gone. And of course they ignored him. But an incident happened where his pilot wanted to paint another Confederate flag on his airplane. And this was a soldier holding the Confederate flag. And in order to get that cartoon painted on the airplane, you had to have the crew chief approve it, the pilot approve it, and then it goes to higher authority, and they give the final. Well, Leon refused that flag or that painting, and they took his airplane away from him and gave it to someone else so that they could put it on it, and they gave him what we considered the worst airplane in the fleet. And so Leon was upset about it. He went to the newspaper, the Richmond Free Press. And that next Thursday or Wednesday, whenever that paper came out, his picture was on the front page of that newspaper, and he was pointing at the airplane and that Confederate flag. Governor Doug Wilder was the governor at the time. He called to the base and he gave them 24 hours to remove every Confederate symbol from that base. Of course, Wilder leaves office. Brooks get fired. I get promoted. During that time, I was promoted to supervision, and I actually was what was called a flight chief. I had about 16 airplanes that I supervised the crew chiefs. So I was actually a crew chief, supervisor. And I moved on from there. They transferred me from being a flight chief to where I actually ran an organization. And this organization was called the Inspection Dock. And every 200 hours, F-16, it comes in for what's called a scheduled maintenance. And during that maintenance, you pretty much rip the airplane to a shell and put it back together.
Who was the influence in your life that sort of resulted in your interest in being a long life steward of the church?
My mother, and and then her mother and father were very active in the church. Actually, one portion of this church was built by my grandfather. He was and he taught school in the neighborhood, and also he was involved with the church. Never held any office, but he was a builder. Actually, he attended a trade school in Manassas and came back to this neighborhood, and he built the first black school in the area. Actually, my grandfather used to own most of the property on Little Skyline Drive. And between he and And of course, the Days was my my mother's family, and the Days, they own quite a bit of the whole neighborhood, and they sold them off to individual families. But my understanding was that my great-grandfather, he was like the chief or the mayor of the community. And most of it was centered in this church, you know, because that's when people really came together, you know, and pretty much all the churches around are having attendance problems, you know, because I think people today, they're really not, I imagine there are so many other things that you can do, options that you have, you know, but, you know, we've had, I've been in the church when there's been lots of members, and I've come to the conclusion where you don't need many. You know, you just need committed members. If you have a few committed members, I think that, you know, you'll be fine. You know, but the main thing is to do the things that the church is designed or supposed to do. And if you can do that, then I think that, you know, it can be successful.
Well, what advice, I mean, a young person is watching this, someone in high school, 15, 16, what would you tell them in general? I mean, there's a number of areas we could speak to, but just in general, what would you say with them, share with them that you learned? Or
I would tell them, find something you like and be the best at it.
mm-hmm.
Be better than anybody,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And I found that out by being an aircraft mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're a crew chief, you launch your airplane and it taxis off and it goes off for an hour and a half, and you have about an hour and a half to, you know, to do whatever until it's time for it to come back. Where I worked, when the guys would launch the airplanes, they would go back into the shop. They would drink coffee, smoke cigarettes, play cards. I would be in the library, you know, and I would read to see.
The big picture.
Yes, you know, and when you learn a lot, and this is what the bonus was, whenever they had an important trip and they needed crew chiefs to go, they're going to want to take the crew chiefs that know the most, you know, and that's how I got to travel. And then when I found out, when I learned that someone was really good at a certain system, or better than I was, I try to stick close to him to learn what he knows, okay? So you have to be very, you know, aggressive as far as trying to be your best, okay? You know, you want to be the best crew chief out there, or whatever you do. If I weld, I want to be the best welder, to where something cracks, they want to bring it to me. That's the advice that I would give. Whatever you do, study it and try to be the best, better than anyone else.